Section 10 of The Golden Slipper and Other Problems for Violet Strange. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Golden Slipper and Other Problems for Violet Strange by Anna Katharine Green. Section 10. Problem 8. The Doctor, His Wife, and the Clock. Part 1. Violet had gone to her room. She had a task before her. That afternoon a packet had been left at the door, which, from a certain letter scribbled in one corner, she knew to be from her employer. The contents of that packet must be read, and she had made herself comfortable with the intention of setting to work at once. But 10 o'clock struck, and then 11, before she could bring herself to give any attention to the manuscript awaiting her perusal. In her present mood, a quiet sitting by the fire, with her eyes upon the changeful flame, was preferable to the study of any affair her employer might send her. Yet, because she was conscious of the duty she thus openly neglected, she sat crouched over her desk with her hand on the mysterious packet, the string of which, however, she made no effort to loosen. What was she thinking of? We are not alone in our curiosity on this subject. Her brother Arthur, coming unperceived into the room, gives tokens of a similar interest. Never before had he seen her so oblivious to an approaching step, and after a momentary contemplation of her absorbed figure, so girlishly sweet and yet so deeply intent, he advances to her side, and peering earnestly into her face, observes with a seriousness quite unusual to him: "Puss, you are looking worried. Not like yourself at all. I've noticed it for some time. What's up? Getting tired of the business?" "No, not altogether. That is, it's not that, if it's anything. I'm not sure that it's anything. She had turned back to her desk and was pushing about the various articles with which it was plentifully bespread. But this did not hide the flush which had crept into her cheeks, and even dyed the snowy whiteness of her neck. Arthur's astonishment at this evidence of emotion was very great, but he said nothing, only watched her still more closely, as with a light laugh she regained her self-possession, and with the practical air of a philosopher uttered this trite remark: "Everyone has his sober moments. I was only thinking—" "Of some new case?" "Not exactly." The words came softly, but with a touch of mingled humor and gravity which made Arthur stare again. "See here, Puss," he cried. His tone had changed. "I've just come up from the Den. Father and I have had a row, a beastly row." "A row? You and father? Oh, Arthur, I don't like that. Don't quarrel with father. Don't. Some day he and I may have a serious difference about what I am doing. Don't let him feel that he has lost us all." "That's all right, Puss, but I've got to think of you a bit. I can't see you spoil in all your good times with these police horrors and not do something to help. Tomorrow I begin life as a salesman in Clark and Stebbins'. The salary is not great, but every little helps, and I don't dislike the business. But father does. He'd rather see me loafing about town, setting the fashions for fellows as idle as myself, than soil my hands with handling merchandise. That's why we quarreled. But don't worry. Your name didn't come up or you know whose. He hasn't an idea of why I want to work. There, Violet, there." Two soft arms were around his neck, and Violet was letting her heart out in a succession of sisterly kisses. "Oh, Arthur, you good boy. Together we'll soon make up the amount, and then—" "Then what?" A sweet, soft look robbed her face of its piquancy, but gave it an aspect of indescribable beauty quite new to Arthur's eyes. Tapping his lips with a thoughtful forefinger, he asked: "Who was that sombre-looking chap I saw bowing to you as we came out of church last Sunday?" She awoke from her dreamy state with an astonishing quickness. "He? Surely you remember him? Have you forgotten that evening in Massachusetts, the grotto, and—" "Oh, it's Upjohn, is it? Yes, I remember him. He's fond of church, isn't he? That is, when he's in New York." Her lips took a roguish curve, then a very serious one, but she made no answer. I have noticed that he's always in his seat and always looking your way." "That's very odd of him," she declared, her dimples coming and going in a most bewildering fashion. "I can't imagine why he should do that." "Nor I," retorted Arthur with a smile. "But he's human, I suppose. Only do be careful, Violet. A man so melancholy will need a deal of cheering." He was gone before he had fully finished this daring remark, and Violet, left again with her thoughts, lost her glowing color but not her preoccupation. The hand which lay upon the packet already alluded to did not move for many minutes, and when she roused at last to the demands of her employer, it was with a start and a guilty look at the small gold clock ticking out its inexorable reminder. "He will want an answer the first thing in the morning," she complained to herself. And opening the packet, she took out first a letter, then a mass of typewritten manuscript. She began with the letter which was as characteristic of the writer as all the others she had had from his hand as witness. "You probably remember the Hasbrouck murder, or perhaps you don't, it being one of a time previous to your interest in such matters. But whether you remember it or not, I beg you to read the accompanying summary with due care and attention to business. When you have well mastered it with all its details, please communicate with me in any manner most convenient to yourself, for I shall have a word to say to you then, which you may be glad to hear, if as you have lately intimated you need to earn but one or two more substantial rewards in order to cry halt to the pursuit for which you have proved yourself so well qualified. The story, in deference to yourself as a young and much preoccupied woman, has been written in a way to interest. Though the work of an everyday police detective, you will find it in no lack of mystery or romance. And if at the end you perceive that it runs, as such cases frequently do, up against a perfectly blank wall, you must remember that openings can be made in walls, and that the loosening of one weak stone from its appointed place sometimes leads to the downfall of all. So much for the letter. Laying it aside, with a shrug of her expressive shoulders, Violet took up the manuscript. Let us take it up too. It runs thus: On the 17th of July, 19 , a tragedy of no little interest occurred in one of the residences of the Colonnade in Lafayette Place. Mr. Hasbrouck, a well known and highly respected citizen, was attacked in his room by an unknown assailant, and shot dead before assistance could reach him. His murderer escaped, and the problem offered to the police was how to identify this person, who by some happy chance, or by the exercise of the most remarkable forethought, had left no traces behind him, or any clue by which he could be followed. The details of the investigation which ended so unsatisfactorily are here given by the men sent from headquarters at the first alarm. When, some time after midnight on the date above mentioned, I reached Lafayette Place, I found the block lighted from end to end. Groups of excited men and women peered from the open doorways, and mingled their shadows with those of the huge pillars which adorned the front of this picturesque block of dwellings. The house in which the crime had been committed was near the centre of the row, and long before I reached it I had learned from more than one source that the alarm was first given to the street by a woman's shriek, and secondly by the shouts of an old man servant who had appeared, in a half-dressed condition, at the window of Mr. Hasbrouck's room, crying, "Murder! Murder!" But when I had crossed the threshold, I was astonished at the paucity of the facts to be gleaned from the inmates themselves. The old servant, who was the first to talk, had only this account of the crime to give. The family, which consisted of Mr. Hasbrouck, his wife, and 3 servants, had retired for the night at the usual hour and under the usual auspices. At 11 o'clock the lights were all extinguished, and the whole house asleep, with the possible exception of Mr. Hasbrouck himself, who, being a man of large business responsibilities, was frequently troubled with insomnia. Suddenly Mrs. Hasbrouck woke with a start. Had she dreamed the words that were ringing in her ears, or had they been actually uttered in her hearing? They were short, sharp words, full of terror and menace, and she had nearly satisfied herself that she had imagined them, when there came, from somewhere near the door, a sound she neither understood nor could interpret, but which filled her with inexplicable terror and made her afraid to breathe, or even to stretch forth her hand towards her husband, whom she supposed to be sleeping at her side. At length another strange sound, which she was sure was not due to her imagination, drove her to make an attempt to rouse him, when she was horrified to find that she was alone in bed, and her husband nowhere within reach. Filled now with something more than nervous apprehension, she flung herself to the floor, and tried to penetrate with frenzied glances the surrounding darkness. But the blinds and shutters having both been carefully closed by Mr. Hasbrouck before retiring, she found this impossible, and she was about to sink in terror to the floor, when she heard a low gasp on the other side of the room, followed by a suppressed cry. "God! What have I done?" The voice was a strange one, but before the fear aroused by this fact could culminate in a shriek of dismay, she caught the sound of retreating footsteps, and eagerly listening, she heard them descend the stairs and depart by the front door. Had she known what had occurred? Had there been no doubt in her mind as to what lay in the darkness on the other side of the room? It is likely that, at the noise caused by the closing front door, she would have made at once for the balcony that opened out from the window before which she was standing, and taken one look at the flying figure below. But her uncertainty as to what lay hidden from her by the darkness chained her feet to the floor, and there is no knowing when she would have moved, if a carriage had not at that moment passed down Astor Place, bringing with it a sense of companionship which broke the spell holding her, and gave her strength to light the gas which was in ready reach of her hand. As the sudden blaze illuminated the room, revealing in a burst the old familiar walls and well-known pieces of furniture, she felt for a moment as if released from some heavy nightmare and restored to the common experiences of life. But in another instant her former dread returned, and she found herself quaking at the prospect of passing around the foot of the bed into that part of the room which was as yet hidden from her eyes. But the desperation which comes with great crises finally drove her from retreat, and creeping slowly forward she cast one glance at the floor before her, when she found her worst fears realized by the sight of the dead body of her husband lying prone before the open doorway, with a bullet hole in his forehead. Her first impulse was to shriek, but by a powerful exercise of will she checked herself, and ringing frantically for the servants who slept on the top floor of the house, flew to the nearest window and endeavored to open it. But the shutters had been bolted so securely by Mr. Hasbrouck, in his endeavor to shut out all light and sound, that by the time she had succeeded in unfastening them, all trace of the flying murderer had vanished from the street. Sick with grief and terror, she stepped back into the room, just as the three frightened servants descended the stairs. As they appeared in the open doorway, she pointed at her husband's inanimate form, and then, as if suddenly realizing in its full force the calamity which had befallen her, she threw up her arms and sank forward to the floor in a dead faint. The two women rushed to her assistance, but the old butler, bounding over the bed, sprang to the window and shrieked his alarm to the street. In the interim that followed, Mrs. Hasbrouck was revived, and the master's body lay decently on the bed, but no pursuit was made, nor any inquiries started likely to assist me in establishing the identity of the assailant. Indeed, everyone both in the house and out seemed dazed by the unexpected catastrophe, and as no one had any suspicions to offer as to the probable murderer, I had a difficult task before me. I began in the usual way, by inspecting the scene of the murder. I found nothing in the room, or in the condition of the body itself, which added an iota to the knowledge already obtained. That Mr. Hasbrouck had been in bed, that he had risen upon hearing a noise, and that he had been shot before reaching the door, were self-evident facts. But there was nothing to guide me further. The very simplicity of the circumstances caused a dearth of clues, which made the difficulty of procedure as great as any I had ever encountered. My search through the hall and down the stairs elicited nothing, and an investigation of the bolts and bars by which the house was secured assured me that the assassin had either entered by the front door, or had already been secreted in the house when it was locked up for the night. "I shall have to trouble Mrs. Hasbrouck for a short interview," I hereupon announced to the trembling old servant who had followed me like a dog about the house. He made no demur, and in a few minutes I was ushered into the presence of the newly made widow, who sat quite alone in a large chamber in the rear. As I crossed the threshold she looked up, and I encountered a good, plain face without the shadow of guile in it. "Madam," said I have not come to disturb you. I will ask 2 or 3 questions only, and then leave you to your grief. I am told that some words came from the assassin before he delivered his fatal shot. Did you hear these distinctly enough to tell me what they were?" I was sound asleep," said she, "and dreamt, as I thought, that a fierce, strange voice cried somewhere to some one, 'Ah, you did not expect me!' But I dare not say that these words were really uttered to my husband, for he was not the man to call forth hate, and only a man in the extremity of passion could address such an exclamation in such a tone as rings in my memory in connection with the fatal shot which woke me." "But that shot was not the work of a friend," I argued. "If, as these words seem to prove, the assassin had some other motive than plunder in his assault, then your husband had an enemy, though you never suspected it." "Impossible!" was her steady reply, uttered in the most convincing tone. "The man who shot him was a common burglar, and frightened at having been betrayed into murder, fled without looking for booty. I am sure I heard him cry out in terror and remorse, 'God, what have I done?'" "Was that before you left the side of the bed?" "Yes. I did not move from my place till I heard the front door close. I was paralyzed by fear and dread." "Are you in the habit of trusting to the security of a latch lock only in the fastening of a front door at night? I am told that the big key was not in the lock, and that the bolt at the bottom of the door was not drawn." "The bolt at the bottom of the door is never drawn. Mr. Hasbrouck was so good a man that he never mistrusted anyone. That is why the big lock was not fastened. The key not working well, he took it some days ago to the locksmith, and when the latter failed to return it, he laughed and said he thought no one would ever think of meddling with his front door." "Is there more than one night key to your house?" I now asked. She shook her head. "And when did Mr. Hasbrouck last use his?" "To night, when he came home from prayer meeting," she answered, and burst into tears. Her grief was so real and her loss so recent that I hesitated to afflict her by further questions. So returning to the scene of the tragedy, I stepped out upon the balcony which ran in front. Soft voices instantly struck my ears. The neighbors on either side were grouped in front of their own windows, and were exchanging the remarks natural under the circumstances. I paused, as in duty bound, and listened. But I heard nothing worth recording, and would have instantly re-entered the house if I had not been impressed by the appearance of a very graceful woman who stood at my right. She was clinging to her husband, who was gazing at one of the pillars before him in a strange, fixed way, which astonished me till he attempted to move, and then I saw that he was blind. I remembered that there lived in this row a blind doctor, equally celebrated for his skill and for his uncommon personal attractions, and greatly interested not only by his infliction, but in the sympathy evinced by his young and affectionate wife. I stood still, till I heard her say in the soft and appealing tones of love, "Come in, Constant. You have heavy duties for tomorrow, and you should get a few hours' rest if possible." He came from the shadow of the pillar, and for one moment I saw his face with the lamplight shining full upon it. It was as regular a feature as a sculptured Adonis, and it was as white. "Sleep," he repeated, in the measured tones of deep but suppressed feeling. "Sleep? With murder on the other side of the wall?" And he stretched out his arms in a dazed way that insensibly accentuated the horror I myself felt of the crime which had so lately taken place in the room behind me. She, noting the movement, took one of the groping hands in her own and drew him gently towards her. "This way," she urged, and guiding him into the house, she closed the window and drew down the shades. I have no excuse to offer for my curiosity, but the interest excited in me by this totally irrelevant episode was so great that I did not leave the neighborhood till I had learned something of this remarkable couple. The story told me was very simple. Dr. Zabriskie had not been born blind, but had become so after a grievous illness which had stricken him down soon after he received his diploma. Instead of succumbing to an affliction which would have daunted most men, he expressed his intention of practicing his profession, and soon became so successful in it that he found no difficulty in establishing himself in one of the best paying quarters of the city. Indeed, his intuition seemed to have developed in a remarkable degree after the loss of his sight, and he seldom, if ever, made a mistake in diagnosis. Considering this fact and the personal attractions which gave him distinction, it was no wonder that he soon became a popular physician whose presence was a benefaction, and whose word law. He had been engaged to be married at the time of his illness, and when he learned what was likely to be its result, had offered to release the young lady from all obligations to him. But she would not be released, and they were married. This had taken place some 5 years previous to Mr. Hasbrouck's death, 3 of which had been spent by them in Lafayette Place. So much for the beautiful woman next door. There being absolutely no clue to the assailant of Mr. Hasbrouck, I naturally looked forward to the inquest for some evidence upon which to work. But there seemed to be no underlying facts to this tragedy. The most careful study into the habits and conduct of the deceased brought nothing to light save his general beneficence and rectitude, nor was there in his history or in that of his wife any secret or hidden obligation calculated to provoke any such act of revenge as murder. Mrs. Hasbrouck surmised that the intruder was simply a burglar, and that she had rather imagined than heard the words which pointed to the shooting as a deed of vengeance, soon gained general credence. But though the police worked long and arduously in this new direction, their efforts were without fruit, and the case bids fair to remain an unsolvable mystery. That was all. As Violet dropped the last page from her hand, she recalled a certain phrase in her employer's letter. "If at the end you come upon a perfectly blank wall." Well, she had come upon this wall. Did he expect her to make an opening in it? Or had he already done so himself, and was merely testing her much vaunted discernment? Piqued by the thought, she carefully reread the manuscript, and when she had again reached its uncompromising end, she gave herself up to a few minutes of concentrated thought. Then, taking a sheet of paper from the rack before her, she wrote upon it a single sentence, and folding the sheet, put it in an envelope which she left unaddressed. This done, she went to bed and slept like the child she really was. At an early hour the next morning she entered her employer's office. Acknowledging with a nod his somewhat ceremonious bow, she handed him the envelope in which she had enclosed that one mysterious sentence. He took it with a smile, opened it offhand, glanced at what she had written, and flushed a vivid red. "You are a brick," he was going to say, but changed the last word to one more in keeping with her character and appearance. "Look here, I expected this from you, and so prepared myself." Taking out a similar piece of paper from his own pocket book, he laid it down beside hers on the desk before him. It also held a single sentence, and, barring a slight difference of expression, the one was the counterpart of the other. "The one loose stone," he murmured. "Seen and noted by both." "Why not?" he asked. Then, as she glanced expectantly his way, he earnestly added, "Together we may be able to do something. The reward offered by Mrs. Hasbrouck for the detection of the murderer was a very large one. She is a woman of means. I have never heard of its being withdrawn." "Then it never has been," was Violet's emphatic conclusion, her dimples enforcing the statement as only such dimples can. "But what do you want of me in an affair of this kind? Something more than to help you locate the one possible clue to further enlightenment. You would not have mentioned the big reward just for that." "Perhaps not. There is a sequel to the story I sent you. I have written it out with my own hand. Take it home and read it at your leisure. When you see into what an unhappy maze my own inquiries have led me, possibly you will be glad to assist me in clearing up a situation which is inflicting great suffering on one whom you will be the first to pity. If so, a line mentioning the fact will be much appreciated by me." And disregarding her startled look and the impetuous shaking of her head, he bowed her out with something more than his accustomed suavity, but also with a seriousness which affected her in spite of herself and effectually held back the protest it was in her heart to make. She was glad of this when she read his story, but later on. However, it is not for me to intrude Violet or Violet's feelings into an affair which she is so anxious to forget. I shall therefore from this moment on leave her as completely out of this tale of crime and retribution as is possible, and keep a full record of her work. When she is necessary to the story, you will see her again. Meanwhile, read with her this relation of her employer's unhappy attempt to pursue an investigation so openly dropped by the police. You will perceive, from its general style and the accentuation put upon the human side of this sombre story, a likeness to the former manuscript which may prove to you, as it certainly did to Violet, to whose consideration she was indebted for the readableness of the policeman's report, which in all probability had been a simple statement of facts. But there, I am speaking of Violet again. To prevent a further mischance of this nature, I will introduce at once the above mentioned account. 2. No man in all New York was ever more interested than myself in the Hasbrouck affair, when it was the one and only topic of interest at a period when news was unusually scarce. But together with many such inexplicable mysteries it had passed almost completely from my mind, when it was forcibly brought back one day by a walk I took through Lafayette Place. At sight of the long row of uniform buildings with their pillared fronts and connecting balconies, every detail of the crime which had filled the papers at the time with innumerable conjectures returned to me with extraordinary clearness, and before I knew it I found myself standing stock still in the middle of the block with my eye raised to the Hasbrouck house, and my ears, or rather my inner consciousness, for no one spoke, I am sure, ringing with the question, which whether the echo of some old thought or the expression of a new one, so affected me by the promise it held of some hitherto unsuspected clue, that I hesitated whether to push this new inquiry then and there by an attempted interview with Mrs. Hasbrouck, or to wait till I had given it the thought which such a stirring of dead bones rightfully demanded. You know what the question was. I shall have communicated it to you, if you have not already guessed it, before perusing these lines. Who uttered the scream which gave the first alarm of Mr. Hasbrouck's violent death? I was in a state of such excitement as I walked away, for I listened to my better judgment as to the inadvisability of my disturbing Mrs. Hasbrouck with these new inquiries, that the perspiration stood out on my forehead. The testimony she had given at the inquest recurred to me, and I remembered as distinctly as if she were then speaking, that she had expressly stated that she did not scream when confronted by the sight of her husband's dead body. But someone had screamed, and that very loudly. Who was it then? One of the maids, startled by the sudden summons from below, or someone else? Some involuntary witness of the crime, whose testimony had been suppressed at the inquest by fear or influence? The possibility of having come upon a clue even at this late day so fired my ambition that I took the first opportunity of revisiting Lafayette Place. Choosing such persons as I thought most open to my questions, I learned that there were many who could testify to having heard a woman's shrill scream on that memorable night, just prior to the alarm given by old Cyrus, but no one who could tell from whose lips it had come. One fact, however, was immediately settled. It had not been the result of the servant woman's fears. Both of the girls were positive that they had uttered no sound, nor had they themselves heard any till Cyrus rushed to the window with his wild cries. As the scream, by whomever given, was uttered before they descended the stairs, I was convinced by these assurances that it had issued from one of the front windows, and not from the rear of the house where their own rooms lay. Could it be that it had sprung from the adjoining dwelling, and that I remembered who had lived there and was for ringing the bell at once. But, missing the doctor's sign, I made inquiries, and found that he had moved from the block. However, a doctor is soon found, and in less than 15 minutes I was at the door of his new home, where I asked not for him, but for Mrs. Zabriskie. It required some courage to do this, for I had taken particular notice of the doctor's wife at the inquest, and her beauty at that time had worn such an aspect of mingled sweetness and dignity that I hesitated to encounter it under any circumstances likely to disturb its pure serenity. But a clue once grasped cannot be lightly set aside by a true detective, and it would have taken more than a woman's frowns to stop me at this point. However, it was not with frowns that she received me, but with a display of emotion for which I was even less prepared. I had sent up my card, and I saw it trembling in her hand as she entered the room. As she neared me, she glanced at it, and with a show of gentle indifference, which did not in the least disguise her extreme anxiety, she courteously remarked: "Your name is an unfamiliar one to me, but you told my maid that your business was one of extreme importance, and so I have consented to see you. What can an agent from a private detective office have to say to me?" Startled by this evidence of the existence of some hidden skeleton in her own closet, I made an immediate attempt to reassure her. "Nothing which concerns you personally," said I. "I simply wish to ask you a question in regard to a small matter connected with Mr. Hasbrouck's violent death in Lafayette Place a couple of years ago. You were living in the adjoining house at the time, I believe, and it has occurred to me that you might on that account be able to settle a point which has never been fully cleared up." Instead of showing the relief I expected, her pallor increased, and her fine eyes, which had been fixed curiously upon me, sank in confusion to the floor. Great Heaven, thought I, she looks as if at one more word from me she would fall at my feet in a faint. What is this I have stumbled upon? "I do not see how you can have any question to ask me on that subject," she began, with an effort at composure which for some reason disturbed me more than her previous open display of fear. "Yet if you have," she continued, with a rapid change of manner that touched my heart in spite of myself, "I shall of course do my best to answer you." There are women whose sweetest tones and most charming smiles only serve to awaken distrust in men of my calling, but Mrs. Zabriskie was not of this number. Her face was beautiful, but it was also candid in its expression, and beneath the agitation which palpably disturbed her, I was sure there lurked nothing either wicked or false. Yet I held fast by the clue which I had grasped as it were in the dark, and without knowing whither I was tending, and much less whither I was leading her, I proceeded to say: "The question which I presume to put to you as the next door neighbor of Mr. Hasbrouck is this: Who was the woman who on the night of that gentleman's assassination screamed out so loudly that the whole neighborhood heard her?" The gasp she gave answered my question in a way she little realized, and struck as I was by the impalpable links that had led me to the threshold of this hitherto unsolvable mystery, I was about to press my advantage and ask another question, when she quickly started forward and laid her hand on my lips. Astonished, I looked at her inquiringly, but her head was turned aside, and her eyes, fixed upon the door, showed the greatest anxiety. Instantly I realized what she feared. Her husband was entering the house, and she dreaded lest his ears should catch a word of our conversation. Not knowing what was in her mind, and unable to realize the importance of that moment to her, I yet listened to the advance of her blind husband with an almost painful interest. Would he enter the room where we were, or would he pass immediately to his office in the rear? She seemed to wonder too, and almost held her breath as he neared the door, paused, and stood in the open doorway with his ear turned towards us. As for myself, I remained perfectly still, gazing at his face in mingled surprise and apprehension. For besides its beauty, which was of a marked order, as I have already observed, it had a touching expression which irresistibly aroused both pity and interest in the spectator. This may have been the result of his affliction, or it may have sprung from some deeper cause. But whatever its source, this look in his face produced a strong impression upon me, and interested me at once in his personality. Would he enter, or would he pass on? Her look of silent appeal showed me in which direction her wishes lay, but while I answered her glance by complete silence, I was conscious, in some indistinct way, that the business I had undertaken would be better furthered by his entrance. The blind have often been said to possess a sixth sense in place of the one they have lost. Though I am sure we made no noise, I soon perceived that he was aware of our presence. Stepping hastily forward, he said, in the high and vibrating tone of restrained passion, "Zulma, are you there?" For a moment I thought she did not mean to answer, but knowing doubtless from experience the impossibility of deceiving him, she answered with a cheerful assent, dropping her hand as she did so from before my lips. He heard the slight rustle which accompanied the movement, and a look I found it hard to comprehend flashed over his features, altering his expression so completely that he seemed another man. "You have someone with you," he declared, advancing another step, but with none of the uncertainty which usually accompanies the movement of the blind. "Some dear friend," he went on, with an almost sarcastic emphasis and a forced smile that had little of gaiety in it. The agitated and distressed blush which answered him could have but one interpretation. He suspected that her hand had been clasped in mine, and she perceived his thought and knew that I perceived it also. Drawing herself up, she moved towards him, saying in a sweet, womanly tone: "It is no friend, Constant, not even an acquaintance. The person whom I now present to you is a representative from some detective agency. He is here upon a trivial errand which will soon be finished, when I will join you in the office." I knew she was but taking a choice between two evils, that she would have saved her husband the knowledge of my calling as well as of my presence in the house, if her self–respect would have allowed it; but neither she nor I anticipated the effect which this introduction of myself in my business capacity would produce upon him. "A detective!" he repeated, staring with his sightless eyes, as if, in his eagerness to see, he half hoped his lost sense would return. "He can have no trivial errand here. He has been sent by God himself to—" let me speak for you," hastily interposed his wife, springing to his side and clasping his arm with a fervor that was equally expressive of appeal and command. Then turning to me, she explained: "Since Mr. Hasbrook's unaccountable death, my husband has been laboring under an hallucination which I have only to mention, for you to recognize its perfect absurdity. He thinks—oh, do not look like that, Constant! You know it is an hallucination which must vanish the moment we drag it into broad daylight—that he, the best man in all the world, was himself the assailant of Mr. Hasbrook." Good God! "I say nothing of the impossibility of this being so," she went on in a fever of expostulation. "He is blind, and could not have delivered such a shot even if he had desired to. Besides, he had no weapon. But the inconsistency of the thing speaks for itself, and should assure him that his mind is unbalanced, and that he is merely suffering from a shock that was greater than we realized. He is a physician, and has had many such instances in his own practice. Why, he was very much attached to Mr. Hasbrook. They were the best of friends, and though he insists that he killed him, he cannot give any reason for the deed." At these words the doctor's face grew stern, and he spoke like an automaton repeating some fearful lesson. "I killed him. I went to his room and deliberately shot him. I had nothing against him, and my remorse is extreme. Arrest me and let me pay the penalty of my crime. It is the only way in which I can obtain peace." Shocked beyond all power of self-control by this repetition of what she evidently considered the unhappy ravings of a madman, she let go his arm and turned upon me in a frenzy. "Convince him!" she cried. "Convince him by your questions that he never could have done this fearful thing." End of Problem 8, Part 1.